Now that we've got a relation component to signify a set of points, such as the orange points and the purple points, and we have the idea of a data binded point, which is the red point here, we're going to go ahead and combine these two ideas into something called a curve, and we're going to make our Vue.js curve component. Let's start by going back into our code editor, and here we are running our npm dev script. And let's go ahead and open up our main app just to recall what's going on. So we have our two relations here, our orange one and our purple one. Let's go ahead and just get rid of those for now. And let's make our curve component. And since we don't have any relation components anymore here, we can go ahead and change this to curve and these other places to curve as well. And that should be good as far as cleanup goes. And let's go ahead now and make our curve component. So we're going to create a new file called curve.vue, and we're going to go ahead and get our component set up here. Let's go ahead and say div curve container. And we'll say the name of the component is curve. And this is a new thing here for us. We're going to say that this extends our relation component, and then we're going to go ahead and need to import that in. And just to make sure that that actually works, let's head over to our browser and see what we've got in our Vue DevTools. Okay, so here's our main app, and here is our curve. And sure enough, we have a color of black and an empty point array. So that means since we didn't add any of those things into our curve component, that means it is successfully inheriting those things from our relation component. So our extension here is working. Okay, and one thing that we will need to do is go into our relation component, and we're going to need to grab this and just paste that into our curve component here. Because one thing that we can't inherit is HTML. We're going to need to redefine that in our extended component here. So that's going to give us all the points for our relation. And beyond that, we want to have this idea of an active point, and that's a point that's going to be bound by data. So let's add that in. We'll say we want a new point here, and that this needs to have an X value of something called active point. We're going to make a new prop here called active point, and just like our other points, these are going to be ordered pairs. So we're going to take the first thing out of the array and the second thing out of the array, and that'll be our X and Y. And now we need to tell our component down here to expect that prop coming in. And we'll give this a type of array and say that the default should be null. Okay, and finally, in order for this to work, we need to head back into our main app component. And we need to say that our curve should have an active point. And we basically just want to recycle this point that we're using here. So to do that, we're going to just add an array in here and say that the X coordinate should be our data prop called X value, and the Y coordinate should be our data prop called Y value. And like before, that was referring in here to our computed property and to our data property here. And since our curve is inheriting the functionality of our relation component, we can go ahead and say that the color should be red, and that should work just like it did before with the relation component. Now we are going to need to go back into our curve component here, and we're going to make sure to pass in that color there. And notice that we don't have any variables called color down here, and again, that's because we're inheriting that functionality from our relation component. So if we go into our browser now and refresh, cool, we have a red point there, and it should move around like before. Now this isn't too different from what we had previously, but we are now using our curve component, so we're well on our way to being able to trace out curves here in the plane. Now the idea that we talked about for that is that if we start here with a fresh screen, we want to be able to move this point around, and the point you see now we're going to again think of as the active point, and every time the active point moves we want to store the old point that it's moving from into an array and to have that stay drawn on the screen. Now luckily in our relation component we do have a prop here called points, and those points are exactly what the relation is going to draw on the plane. So if we think about that, we can go back to our curve component, and knowing that it extends the relation component, really what we need to do is just push a new point into the points array every time this active point prop here changes. So to do that, we're going to use something called a watcher, and what that is similar to things we've seen before. It's going to be a new object here, and we're going to say to watch the active point prop, and whenever that changes, we're going to run this function here. Now something important, we're not supposed to use arrow functions in watchers here, and you can read more about that on the Vue.js documentation. Our watcher will be passed in both the new value that it's changing to and the old value that it's changing from. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to protect against the case where the first coordinate of our new value is equal to the first coordinate of our old value. And that's just something I've noticed with Vue.js. This watch here is going to get called more often than we'd like, and sometimes it gets called when the old value and new value are the same. So we're just going to protect against that here by saying return if these two things are the same. Okay, and just to make sure that this is working like we think it should, let's go ahead and console.log a little message to ourselves. So we'll say that the old value is old value, and let's go ahead and just copy that. We'll say the new value is new value. Save that and head over to the browser, and let's just look at what's happening here. So we start at 0, 0, and nothing's going on here. Once we change this value, we have the old active point was 0, 0, and the new active point is 1, 0.8 something. Okay, great. That seems about right. So if we change that again, now the old point was 1, 0.8, and the new point is 2, 0.9. So this seems to be working just about like we thought. Let's go ahead and gather these values here in variables. And we're really just going to store the old value. We're not going to really do anything with the new value other than use it for this check up here. So we're going to say let old x equal old values x coordinate, and we're going to let old y equal old values y coordinate. And then let's go ahead and push to our points array a new point whose x is old x and whose y is old y. So save that up, head back over, and great, now we have our active point drawing out the curve and storing the old points as we go. One thing that we could improve on, we'll see if we go into our Vue DevTools here. Let's go ahead and refresh this just to start with a fresh set of points. And let's look at our set of points down here. If we move our x forward several spaces, we start to get a lot of points there. And then let's move backwards. Well, you can see that we're adding more and more points. And if we just keep going forward and backwards, then that's just adding more points unnecessarily, since we've really visited the points that we're going over. We don't need to add them to our curve component every time. So to fix this, we're going to go ahead and we're going to add a data property called x collection. And this is just going to be an array of x values that we've already visited. And when we are running our watcher function here, we're going to add an additional check just to see if our old X exists in the array X collection. And if it does, then we're just going to return and not push that point to our points array. And of course, we need to make sure after this check, if it wasn't found, then we need to go ahead and push it to the X collection. So let's save this, head back to the browser and refresh. Then let's watch our points down here. There, we're adding more as we move up from 0 to 1 to 2. And now let's go backwards. And great, we didn't add as many. Notice that the active point is going to get added every time, so you might see a point get added even when it looks like it shouldn't. But as I go from -1 back up to 0, 1, 2, we shouldn't see anything but the active point getting added here. So move that back up, and sure enough, it looks like our points are under control there. So that's looking good. And another thing I notice is right now, let's see, X equals 3 is the active point. So 0, 1, 2, 3. And if I go backwards 1, this point should be the active point. But there's really no way to tell that that's the active point because I've already been over that point. It's just a red point, and there's no way to distinguish it from the other red points. So we're going to add in this concept of an active color, and that'll make sure we can see our active point even if it is somewhere in the middle of the curve. To do this, we're going to go back into our curve component here, and we're going to add another prop called active color. And we'll give this a type of string, and we'll say that the default should be gray. Since the default curve color is black, it'll look like a black curve with an active color of gray moving around on the curve. And then up here in our template, we can go ahead and say that our active point here should have a color of active color. And that should make it stand out a little bit more. Let's see if that worked. Yeah, so we refresh this, and now we have our active point there as we move. And if we move backwards, we'll see that that active point moves along there, and we can still see where it is. Now I can see a little bit of red behind that gray, and in order to fix that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that this point should only exist if the X value in question is not equal to the active point's X value. And that should help that little visual bug there. If we refresh and move backwards, that looks a little bit better. And this is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and jump back over here to our main app file. And let's go ahead and duplicate this just to see how extendable everything is. Let's say that our sign value should, well, let's go ahead and change this to sign of X so that we don't have just a generic thing called Y value. And so we'll change this to sign of X, and we'll change this to sign. And here we'll change this to sign of X. And then let's say we want to graph sine and cosine together. We'll have another Y value called cosine of X. And let's see if we can make these colors here something distinct from each other. That looks good. And let's go ahead and put our cosine value here. And we need to create this computed property here. Cosine X should be given by math.cos of this.x value. So notice that both functions are going to have the same x. It's just going to draw a different curve. This one will draw the sine function, and this one will draw the cosine function. So let's head over to the browser and we'll refresh, see how this works. And cool, it looks like it's drawing them both just fine. And we can see where the active points are as we move back and forth. We can identify those with no problem. Another little tweak that we can do here, if I refresh, we can see that both of these are gray, and so it's kind of hard to tell which is which. So let's change our active point logic here so that in our curve component, the color of the active point is going to depend on whether the curve has been moved or not. So we're going to create a new data prop called moved and say that it's initialized to false. And every time we have a move happen, we'll say this dot moved equals true. And we really only care about the first time, but we're just going to let that run every time the active point changes. And then for our active point, we'll say that the color should be, well, has the curve been moved at all? And if so, then we want it to be the active color. And if not, we just want to use the plain color for that curve. So that'll make it a little more clear here. We can see that our sine function is purple and our cosine function is orange. And then when we move, we get the two active colors, and the 2 points that were left behind are representative of the different curves. So that just gives us a little bit better clue about what our initial state is. We can tell these curves apart a little bit better. And I think this is coming along really well. What we're going to do next is work on the fact that the curve is so far spread out, it doesn't really look like a connected curve, and that's fine, but we might want to change the distance between X sample points so that this orange point to this orange point, for example, might have a very smaller distance so that the curve looks a little more compact and continuous.